Welcome to Education in Focus. I'm your host, Eliana Kernodle. The Department of Education has been in the news a lot lately, and some of its actions have been facing some different legal challenges. Here to tell us more about this is the Center Square's education reporter, Esther Wickham. Esther, can you give us a little bit of background of how we got to where we are?
Yeah, thanks, Eliana. So since Trump has been in office back in March 20th, to be specific, he signed an executive order kind of reinstating his goals as president to essentially take steps in dismantling the U.S. Department of Education. This comes after a long time of people saying, the Department of Education has done more harm than good, from a national level. Students aren't getting their highest quality of education. Test scores are down. Reading proficiency is down. And the president has seen this as an issue, and he, wants ultimately power to be given back to the states, back to local school districts. And so for him, in signing this executive order, he's wanted to, take the good parts of the Department of Education and, put it back to the states so that the states can decide what is best for their students to ultimately increase that level and that quality of education. Obviously, this has come with a lot of pushback from states and from various lawmakers. But ultimately, Secretary Linda McMahon has backed him up, has said that ultimately this is going to be a good thing. And that's kind of what's been happening. There has been some budget cuts. There have been, some steps taken towards that, but even, judges and, certain circuits in the Supreme Court have pushed back, on him because for years and years, we've had the Department of Education, and it is kind of like an unknown thing, a scary thing to take away this big department that has had a big impact since the late 1900s, 20th century.
1900s, 20th century. It's the same thing. It's just two different ways to say it. Yeah. So what has been like the most recent steps that they've taken in this movement towards dismantling?
Yeah, so the biggest one that's kind of been in the news basically for the month of July was back on June 30th, an email from the Department of Education was sent to a lot of education departments within, the nation, stating that these specific federal funds that go to certain programs were not going to be dispersed on July 1. It was currently actually $6.8 billion in federal funding. It was not going to be dispersed on July 1. They've had this funding for years. When the departments of education, plan out their budgets, they're expecting this money to come in. And so for them, that caused a lot of chaos, a lot of panic, saying, this kind of money, is not coming in. What are we going to do? What are we going to do with these programs? And these, parents are expecting these programs to happen. And, I spoke with the Office of Budget and Management with the White House, and they clarified, this is not cutting federal funding. This is a freeze. They're withholding this federal funding right now because in their review and in their investigation, they found that this kind of funding that had been quote unquote going to these programs had been incentivizing, LGBTQ gender ideology within schools, not respecting parental rights, pushing specific ideology that the Trump administration does not condone and doesn't agree with. And so they're saying, okay, what is this funding actually going towards? Before we actually give it to them, let's do an investigation. Let's do a review to figure out what's actually going on. And so since they have withheld that funding, it had been established, if they're actually cutting it, but it's been withheld. So many states have been very upset by this. Recently, this past week, 24 states came together, a part of a coalition, to actually sue the Trump administration for withholding this federal education funding. And obviously the $6.8 billion is dispersed around the country. So each state gets a different kind of amount. So within Arizona, it would be specifically $132 million. Just as an example, if with Nevada, it would be $61 million. Colorado, $80 million. So these are just examples of how that money is cut up and dispersed. And it's mainly dependent on the need and the size of the state and how necessary that funding is. But a lot of attorney generals came together. They sent out a bunch of press releases in response, essentially all saying the same thing, stating that this action by the Trump administration is unconstitutional. It is unlawful overreach of federal power. That's what Nevada Attorney General Aaron Ford said. And, they are all standing together to ensure that these students have access to these programs. And they think that this kind of funding is necessary for engagement, for a thriving society, for students to be, ensure that they have a good and wholesome education. Attorney General for Colorado, Phil Weiser, he says that schools deserve to be treated fairly, and this administration's lack of regard for the impact of this lawless decision is appalling. I'm proud to co-lead this case and will continue to ensure that this administration does not harm Colorado by acting in an illegal fashion. So, again, this is an ongoing thing. We'll see how the Trump administration responds, but I find it interesting that this action has been taken, even though the Trump administration has clarified, this is not a budget cut. This is simply, being withheld while they investigate what the funding is actually for. So that's kind of the recent response in regards to that one piece of the puzzle in dismantling the Department of Education.
Yes, and there's also been developments in kind of another piece of the puzzle. The Supreme Court recently ruled on the Trump administration's move to lay off employees of the Department of Education. Can you tell us a little about that ruling?
Yeah. So basically the court granted, this emergency application that Trump had filed to essentially override the federal judge's ruling that halted the mass layoffs a couple of months ago. I believe it was back in April. And so after a while, it finally got to the Supreme Court. They gave him the go ahead. And so with this, reverse from the lower court's injunction, this would allow Secretary Linda McMahon to proceed in laying off around 1,400 federal employees. And so this obviously this action hasn't been taken yet. This is still an ongoing thing, but that is the estimated amount of people that would be laid off. Obviously, in the dissenting opinion, Justice Sonia Sotomayor said the majority is either willfully blind to the implications of its ruling or naive, but either way, the threat of our Constitution's separation of power is grave. So the response there is saying, again, this is unconstitutional. This is unlawful. The administration shouldn't have the right to, infiltrate this kind of decision. But on the flip side, the Trump administration and Secretary McMahon has said time and time again that this decision is ultimately constitutional because we are giving states that power to decide. We're giving them the right. Yesterday, she was at a annual convention to talk about a little bit about the steps in shutting down the Department of Education. And, a lot of people have called Trump a fascist, specifically the NEA, the National Education Association. They went on a rant. The president, Rebecca Pringle, went on a rant, calling him a fascist. And I found it interesting that Linda McMahon kind of called her out, saying, I don't think you understand, what fascism is, because fascism is ultimately wanting more control, right? More centralization. And here's a president who is trying to distribute it out and make it better. So that's kind of their response of like, you're saying this is unconstitutional and unlawful, but ultimately, the United States is by the people for the people. And that's what the Trump administration is ultimately trying to do. In response to what that step-by-step thing would look like, Secretary McMahon kind of said at that convention, she says, quote, "I would hope our legacy is that we left making things better and stronger. I want to leave best practices to the states. And I think that one of the most important things that we can do as we wind down the bureaucracy in Washington." See, we're not winding down education, we're lifting education. But we have to cut out the bureaucracy and the red tape and all the costs that go along with that. So again, that's kind of their perspective. It's not, we're letting these people go because they're bad workers, or, we're stripping funding so students, don't have a future, don't have an education. They think that they're ultimately leaving a legacy of, Washington is not going to be all up in your business, all up in your hair when it comes to executive decisions, when it comes to statewide and local district decisions. And as the speaker who was interviewing McMahon stated, they're just repurposing all the good parts. So it's a continuing story. There's a lot of stuff happening day in and day out, but that's kind of the crux of what's going on with the U.S. Department of Education.
Well, it certainly will be interesting to see where it goes from here, and if it does in fact get eliminated or just shrunk, or if ultimately the courts rule against some of these measures. But you can continue to follow all of these things at thecentersquare.com.